So I'm going to give a rapid-fire discussion of the Russian Arctic over now 100 years since the time of the Russian Revolution. And as I say here, from reindeer and natural gas to nuclear weapons, because the Russian Arctic shares all those things. I've had the good fortune of spending, as Anastasia said, some months in the Russian Arctic doing field research and archival research. For example, there's some reindeer behind me in Naryan Mar in one of the lower photographs. I talk about the Arctic as a socially and politically constructed space. We often think of regions just being geography, but the Arctic truly is a magnificent example of a socially constructed space. It's important to Russian ideas of sovereignty and military power. It's a place of critical strategic resources, important to the empire, not only today, with oil and gas and metals being crucial. But it's been important to the Russian psyche and the Russian Empire and the Soviet Empire, symbolic of heroism and the verve of explorers, and the way that nature can be put to service of state power. Many people believe that the Arctic, many Russians believe that the Arctic is Russian patrimony. It belongs fully, not only according to other geopolitical conventions, to Russia. But Russia today has become increasingly a zone of military tension. It's always been such, as I will talk about. It's also a place of extensive environmental hazard. It's filled with debris, with petrochemical leaks, with extensive nuclear waste that has not been and may never be cleaned up from the Cold War. And it's a place also of cultural destruction or devastation, of a space of continued forced modernization and displacement of indigenous peoples. Nenets, Evenk, Khanty, Chukchi, and others. The Arctic, the Russian Arctic, is 1/4 of the globe's total Arctic area, second only to Canada, but it's much more developed than the Canadian Arctic. Roughly 1/5 of the Russian landmass is north of the Arctic Circle. I've been fortunate to spend time in the Arctic Circle, and I have even continued my marathon training activities in the Russian Arctic in sub-zero, I speak Celsius now, down to about -30. It's the most urban Arctic area in the world, with 2.5 million inhabitants, down significantly from the Soviet period, but still substantial. And there are also 40 different indigenous ethnic and language groups that cover the Arctic. Russia is strategic minerals and fossil fuels to people in the Kremlin and also to people in the world. Think about the importance of these resources to the current world during the war with Ukraine and the sanctions that the EU put in place, which involved cutbacks on purchases of oil and gas, copper and nickel, and other important resources. Just a few weeks ago, the foreign minister of Russia claimed in an address that Russia is ready militarily to defend the Arctic. This was nothing new in many respects. There are long-term military worries. Many people recall the history of the fact that the Allies intervened in Russia during World War I, with American and British troops even reaching Arkhangelsk from Murmansk. And this is kept in people's minds. But most of what I wanted to talk about in the first part of this lecture is how Russian the Russian state, the Soviet state, and Russian explorers and scientists subjugated the Arctic region, learned about its extensive resources, and put them to service of the state. Under Lenin, of course, with the state in a precarious situation, research was episodic and unsystematic, but it was funded under Lenin. He personally took an interest in supporting various expeditions. For example, Nikolai Knipovich, who was a famous ichthyologist and Arctic explorer. And also in the 1920s, at first at the initiative of Lenin, but later Lunacharsky and other major figures, the Bolsheviks undertook systematic social, scientific, linguistic, and other research of what they called the little northern peoples, including systematizing their languages and providing written languages for people who had passed on knowledge and traditions by word of mouth. Under Stalin, the effort to control and subjugate the Arctic, its people, and its resources accelerated through the main administration of the Northern Sea Route, known as Glav Sevmorput. This involved the efforts of intrepid explorers, rudimentary technology, for example, regular steamers that had metal plates welded underneath, and many of which were crushed in the ice, leading to loss of life. Drift stations. There's a map of one of the drift stations on this slide. Drift stations where explorers would anchor tents to the ice, bring their scientific research tools, and measure things like currents, water temperature, depth of the ocean, and so on. This led, of course, to tremendous victories, great increases in knowledge about the Arctic that the state used for propaganda purposes. The Arctic is ours, we're victorious under Stalin, everything is possible. But there were also significant human costs of telling Stalin's stories. A number of the explorers who returned from these expeditions that resulted in the loss of technology or life, no matter the fact that they weren't provided with sufficient state support, were arrested and condemned as enemies of the state, and a number of them perished in the camps. But throughout it all, the Bolsheviks, and later on Stalin's Bolsheviks, sought to remake the tundra and taiga so that it responded also to the newly instituted 5-year plans. And you can watch in a series of maps, wherever you find them, how rails, forestry roads, and mines extended north and east from Moscow into the tundra and into the taiga. Eventually, wells and pipelines would appear. The railroads that were built by Gulag prisoners were for wealth extraction, not for passengers. And those of you who've had the joys of taking Russian trains know that they still move rather slowly. It can take 24 hours to get from Moscow to Arkhangelsk, although it should only take about 8 hours. And these railroads are important today. For example, in the Yamal mega project, the Yamal Peninsula is perhaps the richest site of natural gas and gas in the world. And so many of the Gulag organizations like Sev Zheldorlag and others were in fact construction organizations to enable the penetration of Arctic regions by prisoners, by scientists, by prospectors, and by workers. I think we can't overestimate the role of the Gulag in subjugating Arctic resources. And this is a very small map of some of the major Gulag camps. One thing to note here is that the efforts of the Gulag organization in developing Arctic resources essentially began in the Northwest. The first camp was at Solovki, and then moved south, east, and then northeast across the landscape. And many of today's objects in Russia, canals, power stations, refineries on the Angara River, roads and railroads, are in fact a gulag in origin. To point out the importance of the social factor in the conquest of the Russian Arctic, you can find in Russian archives and some libraries labor camp newspapers that the prisoners were expected to read, that encouraged higher labor and encouraged workers to overcome their sins and become good, conscious Soviet citizens. Arctic conquest was in fact a national, political, cultural victory over the northern regions of the country. And you can see this in a variety of cultural artifacts, media, and so on from the 1930s to this day in postage stamps on the left and on the right there in coffee table books, in postcards, always showing the tremendous achievements under the leadership of the state and of Stalin until his death, and then later on other leaders, the achievements of these heroic scientists as they mounted drift stations and learned about the Arctic and began to prepare it for economic assimilation at the same time as the Red Army was establishing bases across the region. One of the most fascinating stories about Arctic conquest that I wrote about in my most recent book called Hero Projects, out just in February, concerns Stalin's Polar Magistral, which was to be a railroad that ran from Salihard and essentially the Ob River Bay all the way to, as we can see here, Igarka on the Yenisei. And the project was begun in the late 40s. It was ended within several weeks of Stalin's death because it was so costly in terms of human lives. At least 50,000 people died. But this was one of many different large-scale technological projects to make the Arctic function as part of the Soviet state. Other tools were involved, not only railroads, for example, icebreakers, from the Stalin in 1938 to the nuclear Lenin in 1958, which is now a museum in Murmansk. I had the fortune of being on the Lenin in Murmansk before the museum opened. And then through these icebreakers, which are still being built, third generation icebreakers in the 2020s, achieving a great number of firsts, like the Arctica, the first icebreaker to the North Pole. There was a constant presence of Russian scientists, geologists, explorers, party members, especially from the post-war years until the 1990s, when in the collapse of the Russian economy, there was no more funding for this kind of research. But you can see, excuse me, taking a sip of water, in the chart on the right, that these drift stations, tents and cabins, later much more sophisticated buildings and equipment, were affixed to the ice for months and months and years at a time, essentially from the 1950s until the 1990s, and they have begun again in the 21st century. This was accompanied, of course, by the establishment of company towns in the Arctic. So one thing that distinguishes Russian presence in the Arctic is not only the fact that it's the most urban Arctic nation, but that many of the cities that were built there were built to support the extraction or smelting of one resource. The cities of Monchegorsk, where I've spent some time, Nickel at the Norwegian border, Norilsk, Vorkuta, Salihard, and so on. All of these places came into existence sometimes from the 1940s, but especially under Khrushchev and Brezhnev in the 1950s and 60s and onward. And many of them exist to this day. Norilsk, just a few months ago, was the site of the worst oil leak, perhaps, in Russian Arctic history. And here's just one example of Vorkuta to develop the Pechura coal basin, where there was an infamous uprising of prisoners in 1953 who expected to be amnestied or at least to live better lives after Stalin died, did not receive that privilege and fought against NKVD guards. This uprising was put down with violence. I'm going to turn now to the Arctic Renaissance that has occurred under Vladimir Putin, the president of Russia. I mentioned that in the 1990s, Arctic research essentially collapsed. The drift stations were abandoned. The economy collapsed generally. And so many of the cities dedicated to nickel or copper, platinum, whatever, coal, also saw their production drop considerably, if not to cease. And with the assistance of petro-rubles beginning in the early 2000s, we've seen a rebirth of economic and military activity in the Russian Arctic. In Putin's candidate thesis, Kandidat Nauk, which he defended at, was it the Gorny Institute in Leningrad in 1998, the text set forth there addresses clearly in the author's mind the importance of resource exploitation underneath the control of the state for national economic health and also for state power. And I think that's what we see in the relationship between the president and the Kremlin, the oligarchs, and the extractive industries that are so important in the contemporary resource state of Russia. Some people have questioned whether Putin had the time to write this Kandidat Nauk. He is, as you know, an amateur historian and has views about Russia and Ukraine. But other people say that he did write this, and clearly it's the way he believes. A new Arctic state policy has been set forth on several occasions throughout the 2000s, 2008, 2015, always with revisions, always a bit more military, always a bit more militant, and the president and the Kremlin have a central role in pushing these Arctic policy concepts, which establish Arctic regions as Russia's patrimony and the importance of military control in an increasingly uncertain world. There is a significant state effort to show that Putin has a direct hand in this, for example, with him sedating a polar bear. There's a wonderful website called Putin Doing Things, where you can find a lot of the photographs that have accompanied his outdoor presidency, if you want to call it that. A man of nature, a man of action, a man of resource development. Beginning in the 2000s as well, Russia, one, renewed its military presence in the Arctic, and two, set forth land claims based on geological and geophysical research by Russian scientists to establish that Russian ownership of the sea shelf extended 1,000,000 kilometers more than previously thought, which was recently given approval by a UN organization. On the way there, in 2007, Artur Chilingarov, Duma representative, piloted a bathysphere to the North Pole and planted a Russian flag on the bottom of the Arctic Ocean to claim that Russia indeed owns even up to the North Pole, for which he was rewarded by the president in a special ceremony in the Kremlin. And here are those Arctic resource claims that were approved by the UN Commission on the Limits of the Continental Shelf. And you can see approximately 1.7 million square kilometers of seabed added to Russian claims, which perhaps not so important for military, but certainly important for oil and gas reasons. According to a think tank, Russia has long viewed the Arctic as a crucial source of income, national pride, and strategic importance. And even with the expenditures on the war in Ukraine, it has found budgetary support to expand its arsenals of the Northern Fleet, deploy nuclear submarines, radar stations, airfields, and missile facilities. In fact, Russia operates 1/3 more military bases in the Arctic Circle than all NATO members put together. There's also been in the 21st century a rebirth of, you may recall my comment about the administration of the Northern Sea Route, Glav Sevmorput. And in this case, the central role of Rosatom in rejuvenating the Northern Sea Route. Of course, climate change has a great deal to do with that. Warming waters have enabled ships more easily to traverse from Murmansk to Vladivostok. There's less ice. Icebreakers are still active, of course. But Rosatom has decided that it should play the major role, and it has proclaimed this role in powering the effort to secure the great regions of the Arctic for economic and military purposes. One such feat is a small modular reactor, which is scheduled to open in Yakutia in 3 or 4 years, although it will be over cost and behind schedule if the record of all other nuclear enterprises in the Russian Arctic are an indication. Rosatom is, I would say, ably filling Glav Sevmorput's boots. There's been actually a nuclearization of the Northern Sea Route. There are floating nuclear power stations. There are small modular reactors to be deployed. 5 or 6 new nuclear icebreakers are to be launched by 1930, and other nuclear devices. In fact, some scientists at the Kurchatov Institute, the home of the Soviet atomic bomb project, have set forth drawings at the least, and perhaps some documents to accompany those drawings, of underwater submersible LNG, liquid natural gas, nuclear powered tankers, and also nuclear powered deep sea oil platforms. So here are the new generation of new nuclear icebreakers. In Arkhangelsk one day in a different time, I was able, just running by for my morning run along the Naberezhnaya, to talk the shturman of one of the icebreakers there into letting me come aboard and walk around. I think no number of signed pages of paper would enable me to get anywhere near an icebreaker today. I have 2 kayaks at my summer home, but they are human powered. And here's the new Ritam 200 reactor that is used in floating power stations and for these nuclear icebreakers. can go in, it has a shallow draft, so it can go into estuaries. It can go through ice up to, I forget, 2.8 meters, I think, thick and still steam along, or atom along, I guess is more appropriate. Here's a drawing of the submersible nuclear LNG tanker. Call me a historian, but I have a gut reaction against this. I think it's a bad idea. What we have is a continuation of a tradition of nuclearization of the Arctic that extends, in fact, to Kurchatov, the father of the atomic bomb, who in the 1950s, in 1956, at the same Congress at which Khrushchev gave the secret speech about the cult of Stalin, etc., Kurchatov gave a speech about the need to embark on an extensive nuclear program, including what have become SMRs, small modular reactors, which in Kurchatov's mind would be dropped by parachute into Arctic regions for assembly by workers at a site, and then could power mining, metallurgy, oil extraction, gas pumping, pipelines, and so on. In Bilibina, they built one such small station that is essentially with 4 small reactors in Chukotka, Bilibina, that is based on what is essentially RBMK Chernobyl type reactor, but much smaller scale. And then there are these floating nuclear power stations. The first one left the Baltic shipyards in Petersburg in 2017 or 18, went to Murmansk for loading of reactor fuel, and reached Pevek, Russia's northernmost port, where it was moored in September 2019 to replace the Bilibina nuclear power plant and produce electricity for military and economic and excavation type work in the Arctic region. So this is the academic Lomonosov, who comes from the Arkhangelsk region, so named after the first scientist's son of Russian Arctic. As I mentioned at the beginning, the Gulag pushed roads and railroads and across the Arctic in pursuit of development, and this is now accelerated again, but not to the service of the passenger, but to the service of Gazprom, Novatek, and other gas and oil companies. They have established the Yamal Peninsula and other regions as the Kremlin's patrimony. When this resource development goes forward, it's supposed to involve environmental impact statements, EIS. But as far as I can determine, the EIS are incomplete. Russian journalists, let alone local administrators connected with environmental offices of the state, are rarely permitted to see or investigate the patrimony of Gazprom. Yet the scientific literature that's available reveals the deep sheen of petrochemicals that have begun to cover Arctic regions. Not only that, but the pipelines and roads interrupt Ninet's reindeer migration. They have significant cultural impacts. So there are environmental, cultural, and geopolitical implications of the push in the 21st century to claim and reclaim Arctic resources as Russia's patrimony. In May of 2016, an oil terminal opened in the middle of the Gulf of Aab, about 3.5 kilometers off the banks of the Yamal Peninsula. And this is where Stalin had envisaged his railroad, his magistral, to begin its push from nearby Salahard to the Yenisei and Igarka. And so I think it's not just coincidental, but symbolic. And in Putin's mind, he wished to show that in the 21st century, with the proper leadership, that the Russian state could indeed complete the taming of Arctic resources, and that he could sit comfortably in the Kremlin, push a button, and this pumping station, which would load crude onto ships, would begin functioning almost immediately. Indeed, Putin has pushed for a new northern Arctic railroad, the Severny Shirotny Khod. There's a great literature on it. You can see from the map on the left that it would cover essentially the same route that Stalin had in mind for his road of death with the 50,000 prisoners who perished in the few years of the effort to build the magistral. And once again, commencing terminus at Igarka, I draw your attention to the My iz Igarki, for which Gorky wrote the introduction in 1936, a wonderful piece of literature to celebrate the achievement of Arctic assimilation, written ostensibly by school children who lived in Igarka. So here, once again, is more material about the Polyarnaya Magistral being built now, and in Echo in 2013, scientific journal of the Novosibirsk Akademgorodok, about which I've written a history that was published in 1997, some sharp criticism of the environmental costs of building such a railroad. It would be remiss of me not to mention the fact that at least 6 military bases are being refurbished or established anew in these most recent years. And here's a map of some of them on the right. One of the major achievements is the rebuilding of the Nagurskaya Air Force Base that was established, I believe, in 1947 for long-range bombers, and it used snow and ice runways. They've been replaced by 3.5 kilometer long concrete runways and will enable fighters, bombers, and surveillance planes to have a site in the far north. As I mentioned in the introduction, as the Minister of Foreign Affairs, Lavrov, said just a few weeks ago, Russia is now fully ready to defend its interests in the Arctic. He was worried in his comments about NATO becoming increasingly interested in the Arctic. Finland, Sweden, Norway, even Canada, the United States are NATO members. And Sweden and Finland, as you know, recently joined NATO because of the war in Ukraine. So it is true that NATO is now a greater presence in the Arctic in terms of numbers of countries than it was in 2022. But Russia is the one preparing for any inevitability, as Lavrov has said. And Novaya Zemlya, where the Soviets established a polygon to test nuclear bombs, including the largest ever detonated in 1962, the Tsar Bomba, which was, I believe, 55 megatons TNT equivalent. The head of the Murmansk polygon says that the polygon is ready for attack from NATO, and it's also ready to begin testing nuclear weapons again. So the military has also resumed its presence for Russia in the 21st century. This is what it's like to live in Novaya Zemlya. Pretty painted schools. They have a lot of kindergartners. Looks like pioneers on the left going to school. And the Russian Orthodox Church, of course, is very important in the Arctic Renaissance that's going on, blessing pipelines, nuclear weapons, and MiGs. So a question becomes in the 21st century, is this a high-tech, high-north Russia? Is Russia a scientific superpower? Does this enable Arctic conquest and assimilation in the 21st century with the floating nuclear power stations, with small modular reactors, with icebreakers, with hypersonic missiles that Putin touts? Well, there are a series of problems that Russia now must face as well. It's not only a matter of building, it's also dealing with the environmental costs. And it turns out that there's an extensive legacy from the Soviet period of waste and pollution, and also new contributions by the oil and gas industries in the 21st century. There are extensive environmental risks of military buildup in Arctic regions, as Canadians, Americans, and Soviets knew for so many decades. The northern Russian islands are filled with tens of thousands of barrels of PCBs and other kinds of wastes that must accompany the reestablishment and refurbishment of military presence in fragile Arctic environments. There's been inadequate attention to clean up from the past. There is so much extensive radioactive waste in the Arctic Ocean, not only from nuclear tests. There are, for example, such things as radioisotope thermoelectric generators along the Arctic coast that are used to power remote lighthouses and beacons. Most of them must be decommissioned against intruders. What happens is that people leave the radioactive source behind, but pry open to steal the scrap metal. But there are also thousands and thousands of pieces of radioactive debris. There's sunken reactors, there's sunken submarines, some of which collapsed and failed, sank, others of which were scuttled and sunk by the Soviet Navy. And then there are increasingly accidents involved in the presence of increasingly nuclear north. For example, a radiation accident not far from Severodvinsk, perhaps a failed cruise missile launch of the Burovestnik in August. And here you see extensive petrochemical and other pollution. I have photographs somewhere I could not find today. They may be in the US of petrochemical pollution on Kolguyev Island, which I visited by helicopter some years ago. One might call what's going on in the North today fossil fuel colonialism, as traditional ways of life of the Nenets and other of the 40 groups who occupy the North are colliding over equal pressures to develop oil and gas as quickly as possible. I love the stamp on the lower left-hand side, the 10 kopeck stamp of celebrating the Nensi, the Nenets people, with modernization clearly behind. Oil and gas are the future, are the strength of Russia. So really, when you look at the papers, you rarely see talks about accidents or the cultural costs to indigenous people. This is, of course, not only in Russia, it's throughout the countries of the world where resources are important to urban people and to militaries and local people pay the costs. But at least sometimes there are representatives of society to make it better through prayer. And here, as I mentioned before, the extensive Arctic nuclear waste, which had been going under fairly substantial cleanup practices until 2010, 2011, in part with funding from Western nations, but that ended entirely in 2014 with the annexation of Crimea, and Russia must go alone on cleanup. One hopes that the government finds funds for this, or the Arctic will become less white and more radioactive. There were 87 nuclear experiments, air, 3 land and 3 underground nuclear explosions at Novaya Zemlya alone. And here's a map near Murmansk, where I have visited, of the various Northern Fleet naval bases where significant quantities of spent fuel, spent reactors, decommissioned submarines, and so on are anchored in bays and are rotting. The president insists on cleanup. I guess it was in 2017, Putin declared a year of ecology or the environment. But the Novosibirsky Islands, this is the waste left behind. And the impacts on the indigenous people will continue and will accelerate. I guess what I would say, looking back over 100 years, is that the Soviet legacies of technologies and waste persist at the same time as the approaches to resource development and ideology of ownership continue to this day. This is the Stalin's Polar Magistral. In an increasingly conservative and religious-based society, the Russian Orthodox Church is contributing to efforts to conquer the Russian North, but I would say without providing the moral guidance needed to do so from an environmental point of view. I was involved for many years with Severodvinsk as the president of a sister city organization, Portsmouth, New Hampshire, Severodvinsk, Russia. Spent some time there for people along the White Sea who are bathing in the summer. I suppose it's unimpressive to see a nuclear submarine go by, but it does give you a sense of the cognitive dissonance about what the Arctic is. It was a place of inspiration for the first explorers in the 1920s and 1930s. And now it's a place like any other, urban, with nuclear devices, and with the typical industrial pollution that accompanies them. But this is the program of the Russian state, which views the Arctic regions now as patrimony.
And the first question we received, Paul, is about the environmental movement in Russia. Is there any sort of environmental movement? Do environmental groups have any input on all this development in the Arctic, or are there other opinions basically suppressed? And what does the typical Russian citizen think of all this Arctic development and pollution?
The environmental movement in Russia, in contemporary Russia, faces severe headwinds in the effort to express concern about the significant environmental danger and already the damage done to the environment and to local peoples across the Arctic. In the early 2000s, building on the 90s, and the openness of that period and the openness of the Gorbachev period, there were a number of significant and active environmental groups. For example, Ecozashita is one of them. They're still pretty active. They have a website with a lot of information about their activities. There's also Plotina.net, which operates with a focus on Siberian questions. But Russian laws have essentially emasculated environmental movements. So it's very difficult for individuals, let alone groups, to protest against this kind of thing. As you know, there's the one law that requires organizations that have any kind of ties or financing from outside the country to register as foreign agents. And this has destroyed or limited the activities of a great number of groups. So there are people who get involved, who write letters to local government officials as individuals, worried about garbage, worried about oil spills, and so on. There was a seemingly successful effort to prevent the opening of a waste dump, a landfill outside of Arkhangelsk just a few years ago, which is something that many people didn't expect. But generally speaking, environmental activism has become restricted so extensively that it's hard to see it being reborn again at this moment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I remember that at some point Greenpeace in Russia was pretty active, but I'm not sure what happened to them after the war started. Probably they are not around anymore. And yeah.
Yeah, there are some groups which have managed to continue their activities. The one that's concerned about nuclear activities is based in Norway. It's called Bellona, the Bellona Foundation. And it produces first-rate research that I encourage anyone interested in nuclear waste to look into. And nuclear waste is a world problem. It's not a Russian problem. It may be more extensive in the Russian Arctic than any other Arctic region. But I've calculated in other work that the world may end up paying $1 trillion or $1.5 trillion to clean up all the radioactive waste from the Cold War.
Mm-hmm. Could you tell us a bit more about pre-revolutionary Arctic explorations? And someone is wondering if Admiral Kolchak was involved in the Arctic exploration. Do we know about it?
Yes, I recall reading about Kolchak and his work. There was Arctic research dating from the mid-Petrine period and into the 19th century. But explorers at that time had to be seriously intrepid, if not a little bit crazy. The explorers that you read about in Norway or Sweden or Russia or Brits and Scots truly did risk life to move into the Arctic region. So in my book on Arctic conquest, I talk about some of these expeditions and the challenges that these people faced. At that time, all research was really path-breaking and fundamental. What does the land look like? What creatures are there? People tabulating which kinds of birds, which kinds of small mammals, flora and fauna cataloging, discussions of the hardship of getting into the north on horses with sleighs. Very few ships were strong enough to get into the Arctic regions and survive. The sailing season without ice might be 2 months, August, September. The throat of the White Sea into the Barents Sea was frozen pretty much all of the time, so that the efforts were usually by land. They were short-term, they were heroic. There's a big literature on it. There are a number of publications by those scholars. but it didn't become systematic really until being forced by Stalin in the 1930s. Even in the 1920s, funding lagged, although the number of expeditions and number of explorers increased significantly already in the 1920s.
Mm-hmm. There is an interesting question from Douglas. He's wondering how many Chernobyl type RBMK reactors are located in the Russian Arctic. And to kind of extend this question, I would probably ask you, did Chernobyl in any way influence any activity in the Russian Arctic in the 20th century and in the 21st century?
Okay. The Bilibina nuclear power station reactors were small, of Chernobyl design. They were the only ones. The station has been shut down and dismantled. It was, although of the same design, never at risk of producing a kind of Chernobyl type experiment. There are, I believe, 10 Chernobyl type reactors operating still in Russia, the 4 at Chernobyl having been shut down. There are 4 just outside of St. Petersburg, for example, at the Leningrad nuclear power station. So today's effort involves reactors which are considered to be inherently more safe than anything like a Chernobyl reactor, which of course also is dangerous because it has no containment, so that if there is an explosion, the products of fission will go beyond the reactor building. Whereas the pressurized water reactors that are fairly much standard everywhere in the world and that are noted in Russia by VVER, pressurized water reactors, do have a containment vessel. Still, one has to worry about the hubris of engineers in Rosatom who are sending floating reactors into Arctic waters to power further developments. And I find it a bit risky. I've talked with scholars at MIT who are also pushing this design as safe and worthwhile. But I think costly, risky, and with great lag has been the history to date.
Mm-hmm. But is nuclear power is basically the only efficient way to operate in the Arctic, or there are some greener technologies now that would allow that as well?
A lot of people push nuclear power in the Arctic because internal combustion is much harder to work, although there's a lot of oil and gas. I mean, diesel cars, for example, people who live in Arctic regions realize how hard it is to get their vehicles started on cold winter mornings. So powering Arctic development through electricity with nuclear power would seem to be a panacea. And you have the Kola nuclear power station in Polarny Zori on the Kola Peninsula. You have this floating nuclear power station, the Academic Lomonosov in Pevek. And I think Russian engineers plan on extending nuclear power into the Arctic precisely because it seems too difficult to put wind turbines there, or to rely on solar power when you have the winter darkness. I was in Murmansk some years ago on a January 9th when the sun was rising for the first time in 3 or 4 weeks. So I ran to the top of the Murmansk fjord to see it, and it was deeply unimpressive. I realized when I got to the top of the fjord why no one else had run up to greet the sun, and then I ran back down. So there's really, solar doesn't seem to be, wave power might be possible, but nuclear does in some ways make sense. And building and maintaining grids, power lines, and high tension towers has always been a difficulty in Arctic climates.
Mm-hmm. There is a note from Natalie. Greetings from Central Maine, Paul. Thank you for your talk. Did I hear correctly that the UN approved of Russia's acquisition of 1 million kilometers of Arctic seabed? What was the reasoning given?
The reason given, these documents are online. Greetings to Central Maine, by the way. I spend the summers there on an island off the coast. It's too hot in Barcelona. The Russian geophysicists, geologists, and engineers presented sufficient data to show that landmass that extended from the Russian shore was in fact part of the Russian shore and not another geological ridge, that type of thing. So these documents are online. You could look at the United Nations Commission results. They posted all of these results, and I was surprised, but they try not to let politics mix in. They try to base it all on scientific data. We'll see what happens.
And are there any other regions in Russia or the Russian Empire that have received as much attention as the far north?
You know, I think not, especially in the past 10 years or so, with the exception of obviously of the war on Ukraine. It really is a subject of human imagination, of dreams, of what we can accomplish. Can we control nature in these very, very difficult climates? The Nenets have done some, the Khanty, the Chukchi, they've developed reindeer husbandry, they've hunted walrus, they've hunted whale. But there are so many more extensive resources. Can we not somehow secure them, develop them, and make them available for the national wealth of the country? I think it's in one of my slides, but as I recall, if the Arctic regions have only 1% of the Russian nation's population, something like 15% of national wealth is created there.
Mm-hmm.
And I think also dating to the 1930s. In the 1930s, the Arctic conquest was one way in which the Bolshevik state showed that the nation was a modern power to be reckoned with, based on science, based on what humans can achieve. Another was aviation. The Soviet pilots were the first to navigate to the North Pole, over the North Pole. Several planes flew from the Soviet Union to the United States and Canada over the North Pole in tremendous propaganda feats. It's sort of like the 1930s were a time of the space and Arctic races, the way that the 1960s was a time of the space race. And so with its nuclear icebreakers, with its oil and gas industries, there's kind of a nostalgia for the glory days of Soviet science and technology that are being manifested again with enlightened leadership in the Kremlin in the 21st century.
Mm-hmm. We also spoke a lot about the pollution and nuclear waste, but Vera is curious if Russia's nuclear activity in the Arctic adding to melting of the Arctic sea ice and global warming issues in general.
Yes. What is Russia? It's a petronation. It produces oil and gas as a major form of income. It sells oil and gas in international markets. It heats its cities with oil and gas and coal. So both directly and indirectly by industrial extractive activities on the tundra and through the production of greenhouse gases, Russia is a major contributor to global warming. And we've already seen the damage to Arctic regions. There are NASA and other photographs, taken from space that show the shrinkage of ice. Permafrost is melting. Doesn't sound so permanent any longer. And when the permafrost melts, often methane, which is a significant greenhouse gas, is released. So it's becoming a greater and greater problem. So I think Russian leaders have in the past talked about the need to do something about global warming, but that has gone by the wayside, and the effort is to produce more oil and gas as a source of national income. So contributing to climate change and destruction of the permafrost, not the other way around.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Paul. And the last question I would like to discuss is the international aspect of the Arctic exploration. You showed this map indicating different countries and what they own or explore in the Arctic: Canada, USA, Norway, Greenland. Who plays the biggest role besides Russia? Who played in the 20th century? Who plays now? And who will play in the future?
Yes. We can see a burst of interest in cooperative Arctic research during the international polar years, the most recent one being 2007, 2008. Russia was a leader then, along with the other members of the Arctic Council, the 7 nations, the United States, Canada, Denmark, Sweden, Finland, Norway. China has increased its presence in the Arctic in a research sense as well. So I think Russia, because of its tradition dating to the 1920s of asserting that its mission, both for nation and perhaps for the world, is to understand how the Arctic operates and to make it available for the Russian people, will continue to be a major research actor into the 21st century. But research, cooperative research, which is really needed for the Arctic, for space, for other spheres of activity which are really expensive, has collapsed entirely. Funding that used to come from European and US and Japanese organizations that enabled Russian scholars and Japanese, American, European scholars to work together has disappeared. And the Russian government doesn't seem to care as much about Arctic research as it did in past years, especially when it's cutting funding for healthcare, for example, as it tries to carry out war in Ukraine and military activities in the Arctic. So I see Russia remaining a tremendous scientific power in the north, but having a much more difficult time doing so because of funding and other restrictions as we move into the 2030s.